Correspondent for the Australian newspaper, Adam Creighton, joins us. Adam, excuse me, thanks so much for your time. We are watching inflationary pressures in the United States like a hawk here in Australia. So what is life like there? It's got a lot more expensive, and the Federal Reserve is really having to put its toughest measures in place really since the 1980s.
Yeah, well, look, the US has been the first out of the blocks, if you like, with inflation. It's got the highest annual rate of inflation in the Western world at the moment. The good news here is that it's expected to start falling, and we get the inflation figure for April in just a few days. So the forecast there is that the inflation rate's going to fall from about 8.5% to about 8%. So still very high. Is it expensive? Yes, it is expensive. I mean, just on a personal level, I've noticed things increase. My own haircut has gone up 25% just recently since I arrived. So that's a service too. It's not it's like not related to the price of oil or to the price of food. So it's just an example of the fact that services are actually going up as well. So it's not just related to the war. It's not just related to the price of oil. It's a monetary phenomenon. The growth of money is out of control, etc. So I think the lesson for Australia is that inflation will keep increasing. I mean, the rest of the world's just a bit behind the US. That's all in this process.
Australia looks like it's a bit behind the rest of the world as well, moving slow on interest rates. The RBA has been criticised for flagging that interest rates wouldn't rise until 2024. Obviously, people made investments essentially on that promise, and we only get this inflation data every quarter. I mean, from where you sit, it seems a little backwards, doesn't it?
Yeah, look, I mean, back in the old days, I used to work at the Reserve Bank, and certainly the economists at the bank had always been very frustrated that Australia only had an inflation reading every 3 months. That's very unusual in the Western world. And certainly now, yes, they would certainly like to have a monthly reading because it's so critical right now. But I think the bigger point for central banks around the world, including Australia's, is it's going to be a very difficult few years. I mean, they're facing high inflation, which is far ahead of their targets, both in the US and Australia. But personally, I think they're not going to have the guts to lift rates because, as we are already seeing in the US very starkly, that even small increases in interest rates are going to see these large falls in the stock market, potentially large falls in house prices. And that's when you're at interest rates of 1 or 1.5%, which is nowhere near the levels of 8 or 9% interest rates that most economic models would say you need to get inflation back down again. So it's going to be a really hard 2 years.
So the debate here, as you know, Adam, has been about wages. Labor has been talking about this for the better part of a decade and really honing in on that in the last 3 years. It's, central to their re-election strategy. We just had Anthony Albanese. He's kind of wedged between, wanting to make this something that a Labor government can deliver, but knowing full well that the Fair Work Commission sets a minimum wage rate. So the unions want that to be 5.5% increase. Anthony Albanese has just said that he would support and welcome a 5.1% increase. As an economist, explain what inflationary pressures that would bring in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, certainly historically, the Australian industrial relations system has had a real problem because when one industry gets a wage rise, it filters through to other industries through the Fair Work Commission, and that's a legacy of the Labor Party, the Labor government, the Gillard government, in fact. So I think personally, the federal government should be staying out of these kind of wage issues and leave it as much as possible to individual businesses. There's always a risk of wage price inflation spiral. Where you lift wages and then that pushes up prices and then it feeds back through through each of the variables, which is what happened in the 70s and 80s to devastating effect. Right.
So a wage increase on inflation might have inflationary pressures on interest rates. Like, how would the RBA look at that?
Yeah, because it increases demand.
Yeah.
It increases demand. Yeah, that's exactly right. But I mean, the bigger question for governments is, I mean, the best thing they can do to increase wages is to cut income tax. That's the best way that they can increase people's take-home pay is just to cut income tax. But you're not seeing much of that on either side of politics in Australia.
No, not at all. Adam, fascinating to talk to you as always. We'll speak to you about
Thanks,
Donald
Laura.
Trump and him being kingmaker in the lead up to the midterms as well. We'll see you soon.